The phone rang 3 times before I even had the strength to pick it up. "Dad, quit the act," my son Jason barked through the line. "Stop pretending, Mom's gone, and Vanessa comes first." I froze, gripping the edge of my dining table, my coffee cup trembling. "Jason, your mother just died?" I whispered, my voice breaking. Silence. Then a sigh from the other end, followed by, "I said stop the act, Dad. She comes first." I sat back, staring at the empty chair across from me, where Margaret should have been. My heart pounded. I could feel the weight of every year we'd shared. All the dinners, the holidays, the quiet nights in Cedar Rapids. I tried again. "Jason, this isn't about Vanessa, it's about your mother. Are you even listening?" The line went dead. I let out a slow breath, my hands dropping to my lap. I looked at the calendar, today's date marked with a red circle, the anniversary of our first meeting. Everything felt surreal. I muttered under my breath, "I can't believe he would say that." I hung up and stared out the window at the pale winter light filtering through the blinds. Only if this story speaks to your heart, hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment with your city and the local time where you're watching from. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 74 years old, and this night changed everything in my family forever. And the real lesson you're going to see in this video, stay with me until the end. And now let me take you back to where it all began. It started with a call I never thought I'd make, a morning filled with an eerie silence. I remember my hands shaking as I dialed Jason's number, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jason, it's Dad. Margaret, she's gone." I heard him shuffle papers, the faint clinking of a wine glass in the background. "Dad, stop the act," he said again. "She comes first." My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. "Stop the act? Stop the act? Jason, she's been my wife for 49 years. 49 years. I cried, though no one could see me. "I need you to be here. You need to come home." There was a pause. "I can't, Dad. I'm busy." I pressed the phone to my ear, heart pounding in disbelief. "Busy? It's her funeral." The silence was deafening. I sank into the worn leather chair by the window. Snow was drifting lazily across our yard, each flake reminding me of every shared Christmas, every birthday, every quiet evening together. I felt utterly alone. And yet, I realized something. I wasn't entirely powerless. There was a truth that no one knew, a secret Margaret had whispered years ago, something hidden in the folds of our family's plans, something that would shift everything. My eyes drifted to the mantel where her photograph smiled at me, serene and knowing, and I understood that the battle had already begun, though Jason and Vanessa didn't yet realize it. What I found in the documents on her nightstand would make them question everything they thought they owned. The house was quiet that morning, sunlight slipping through the blinds and casting long stripes across the wooden floor. I walked into the kitchen, still smelling the faint aroma of Margaret's chamomile tea from the night before. The fridge hummed softly, a stark contrast to the emptiness I felt. I thought back to my childhood in Des Moines, where my father favored my brother, giving him the bigger slice of pie, the newer coat, the first choice of anything that mattered. "Harold, eat your vegetables." My mother would chide me gently while my brother laughed at the extra dessert waiting for him. Those early lessons in fairness and injustice had etched themselves into my soul. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and looked at the worn oak table where Margaret and I had spent decades raising Jason. I remembered the night we moved him into his dorm at Northwestern. "Dad, you promised you would be there," he said, eyes shining with anticipation. I had to swallow my own tears and nod. "I will, son," I said, even though I knew I could not always control what life demanded of me. Vanessa had always been present, shadowing him like a specter, influencing his choices subtly yet profoundly. "Come on, Jason, maybe Dad does not understand," she whispered one evening as we tried to discuss his college plans. I had felt the sting immediately, recognizing the first signs of manipulation, the way she framed the narrative, even in casual conversation. I glanced around the living room, noticing the photograph of Jason at his high school graduation, framed by Margaret, her smile soft and proud. How many times had I reminded Jason to call his grandparents, to check in, to remember where he came from? Yet, the calls were sporadic, the visits brief, the moments cherished by me alone. "Dad, you are making a big deal out of nothing," Jason had once said after I questioned why he had skipped Thanksgiving. His tone dismissive, his eyes avoiding mine. Even back then, The pattern was clear. Now, staring at the empty kitchen, I felt a pang of those old wounds flare anew. Margaret would have wanted me to see clearly, to recognize the intentions behind these behaviors. I set the kettle on the stove and poured the boiling water into my mug, each movement deliberate, grounding me. I recalled the first time I had bought him a car for his 16th birthday, the excitement on his face, the gratitude fleeting as Vanessa suggested another model would be better, one more in line with her family's taste. I had swallowed my pride then, but I remembered the lesson. Appearances can be deceiving, and those who speak sweetly may harbor different intentions. "Dad, you should not worry about trivial matters," Jason had said over the phone years ago, his voice smooth, practiced. I had known then that I would have to protect myself quietly, observe, and remember. As I sat at the kitchen counter, the sun climbing higher, illuminating the dust motes in the air, I could hear the faint creak of the upstairs floorboards, where the echoes of our family's laughter used to resonate. I whispered to myself, "All these years, and I have seen it coming, haven't I?" There was a note of both sorrow and determination in my voice, and I knew the next steps would define not only the legacy Margaret and I built, but also the truth Jason and Vanessa would finally confront. I reached for a notebook on the counter, the one Margaret had kept with meticulous care, and opened it to a blank page, ready to record every memory, every detail that could illuminate what had really happened behind the polite smiles and courteous words. The kettle whistled softly, a reminder that time moves relentlessly forward, and that each small action carries weight. And as I wrote the first line, I realized that the smallest observations, the way Jason's eyes lingered too long on a contract, the careful positioning of Vanessa's hands during conversations, the subtle choices made over years, would all culminate into a revelation so precise, so inevitable, that no one in the family could dismiss it. The shadows in the room lengthened as the morning deepened, and I felt the stirrings of resolve, knowing that while the past had been shaped by unfairness and omission, the coming days would bring a reckoning, a silent unveiling of truths long concealed. The notebook stayed open on the kitchen counter for most of the afternoon. I kept adding names, dates, little moments that had seemed harmless at the time, but now felt important. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. The screen showed Richard Coleman. I stared at it for a moment before answering. "Harold, how are you holding up?" he asked gently. "I have been better," I replied. There was a pause. I was expecting that answer. Richard had known Margaret and me for more than 30 years. He was one of the few people who still spoke plainly. "There is something I need to discuss with you," he said. "Not over the phone. Can you come by my office tomorrow?" Normally I would have asked questions. Normally I would have tried to avoid anything that felt confrontational. But something inside me had shifted. "I will be there," I said. After I hung up, I noticed a text from my younger sister, Diane. We had not spoken much in recent years, mostly because family gatherings had become complicated. The message was short. "Call me when you can." I dialed her number. She answered immediately. "Harold, I just heard about Margaret." Her voice cracked. "I am so sorry." "Thank you," I said quietly. "Where is Jason?" she asked. I looked out the window. "That is a good question." Diane went silent for a few seconds. Then she said something that surprised me. "I have been wanting to tell you this for years." My grip tightened on the phone. "Tell me what?" "Every family event, every holiday, every birthday you missed, Jason always made it sound like you and Margaret chose not to come." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "People thought you stopped caring," she said. "Vanessa would tell everyone you were too busy or too stubborn to participate." I felt a cold sensation settle in my chest. "That is not true." "I know that," Diane replied. "But not everyone else did. For years I had assumed people simply drifted away. Suddenly another possibility appeared. Maybe someone had been helping that distance grow." After the call ended, I walked upstairs to my bedroom. Margaret's side of the closet remained untouched. Her blue sweater still hung exactly where she left it. I sat on the edge of the bed and remembered something she once said after a family barbecue. "Do you ever feel like people only hear half the story?" she had asked. At the time I laughed it off. Now I wondered what she had seen that I ignored. Later that evening, another unexpected thing happened. My neighbor Frank knocked on the door carrying a casserole dish. "You need to eat," he said. "I am fine." "No, you are not." He placed the dish on the counter and looked directly at me. "But you are stronger than you think." Most of my life, I would have smiled politely and change the subject. Instead, I told him everything. The phone call, the silence, the strange conversation with Diane. When I finished, Frank nodded slowly. Sounds like somebody has been writing the family story for a long time. His words stayed with me long after he left. That night, before going to bed, I checked my voicemail. There was one new message. It was from Jason. For a brief second, I thought he might finally be calling about his mother. Instead, his voice sounded rushed. "Dad, Richard Coleman called me. Why does he want to meet with you? Call me back." I listened to the message twice. Then, for the first time in years, I did not call my son back. I set the phone down, turned off the light, and stared into the darkness. Somewhere inside Richard's office, and somewhere inside the secrets Margaret had left behind, was a truth that suddenly had everyone nervous. And I had a feeling tomorrow would be the day the first piece finally surfaced. The next morning, I drove through the cold Iowa air toward Richard's office with a feeling I could not quite explain. The roads were familiar, but everything else felt different. For years, I had accepted confusion as part of getting older. I had accepted missed invitations, unanswered calls, and awkward silences. But now those memories were beginning to connect. Richard greeted me at the door and led me into a private conference room. A thick folder sat on the table between us. "Before we discuss anything else," he said, "there is something Margaret wanted you to see." He opened the folder and slid several pages across the table. At first, they looked ordinary. Printed emails, family messages, calendar screenshots. Then I noticed the dates. My stomach tightened. One email showed a family reunion from 3 years earlier. I remembered being told it had been canceled. Yet there were dozens of messages discussing seating arrangements, catering, and hotel reservations. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Richard adjusted his glasses. Margaret started collecting these after she became suspicious. My chest felt heavy. Another page showed a group message involving several relatives. Someone had written, "I hope Harold is feeling better." The response came from Vanessa. He and Margaret decided not to come. They prefer keeping to themselves these days. I stared at the words. We had never received an invitation. Not once. Richard handed me another document. This one hurt even more. It was a chain of emails involving Jason, my son. There, in plain text, was a message he had sent to multiple family members. "Dad gets overwhelmed at gatherings now. It is easier if we leave him out." I looked up slowly. "He wrote that?" Richard nodded. "Margaret found it 6 months ago." For a moment, I could not speak. I remembered every holiday spent wondering why fewer people called. Every birthday card that stopped arriving. Every family photo I saw months later on social media. All those years, I believed people had forgotten me. The truth was worse. They had been given a story about me. A story repeated so often that everyone accepted it as fact. I felt a sharp ache behind my eyes. Why would Jason do this? I asked. Richard leaned back in his chair. "I cannot answer that. But Margaret believed someone wanted distance between you and the rest of the family." As if on cue, my phone buzzed. "Diane." I answered immediately. "Harold, something strange happened," she said. Her voice sounded nervous. "What is it?" "I ran into Aunt Carol this morning. She said she always felt bad that you ignored her invitations." I closed my eyes. I never ignored anything. That is exactly what I told her. There was a pause. "Harold, everybody believed it." The room seemed smaller. Years of relationships had been slowly poisoned by lies I never knew existed. Richard quietly placed one final envelope in front of me. Unlike the others, it was sealed. Margaret's handwriting covered the front. My name. Nothing else. "She instructed me to give you that only after you saw the rest," Richard said. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Whatever was inside, Margaret had wanted me to learn the truth first. I carefully broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and as my eyes reached the first sentence, it felt as though the floor beneath my entire life suddenly disappeared. The first sentence of Margaret's letter was simple. "If you are reading this, then the loneliness finally became impossible to ignore." I stared at the page until the words blurred. Richard remained silent across the table while I continued reading. Margaret wrote about things she had noticed over the years. Not dramatic events. Small things. Patterns. She described holiday invitations that arrived after the event had already happened. Birthday cards that never reached us. Family photographs we only discovered months later. She had documented everything. Dates. Names. Screenshots. Notes written in her careful handwriting. By the time I finished the letter, my hands were shaking. She knew. I whispered. Richard nodded. She knew more than you realize. Over the next several days, I tried to repair what had been broken. At first, I believed there had to be some misunderstanding. Surely years of distance could not have been built entirely on deception. I started making calls. My cousin Robert answered on the second ring. Harold, he said cautiously, I have not heard from you in years. I tried, Robert. Silence followed. Then he replied, we thought you wanted nothing to do with us. I closed my eyes. That was never true. We spoke for 20 minutes. By the end of the conversation, both of us sounded exhausted. The damage was deeper than either of us expected. The next day I sent emails. 12 of them, each carefully written. No accusations. No anger. Just facts. I explained what Margaret had discovered and attached copies of several messages. Some relatives responded with shock. Others never replied at all. One email came back with only 3 words. Too late now. I printed letters and mailed them to relatives who rarely used computers. I spent nearly 2 hours at the post office. As I slid each envelope across the counter, I felt as though I was mailing pieces of my life away. A week later, only 4 people responded. 2 apologized. One admitted she had repeated things she now realized were false. The 4th simply wrote, I do not know what to believe anymore. The hardest call came from Aunt Carol. Harold, she said softly, for years I thought Margaret looked down on us. My chest tightened. She loved this family. I know that now, Carol replied. But that is not what we were told. Everywhere I turned, I found the same pattern, the same story, the same carefully planted narrative repeated over and over until it became accepted truth. One evening I looked through my phone records. There were dozens of unanswered calls I had made over the years. Holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, evidence that I had been reaching out while others believed I was withdrawing. The realization left me numb. I sat alone in the living room as darkness filled the house. Margaret's favorite lamp cast a small circle of light across the carpet. My phone remained silent. No messages from Jason. No explanation. No apology. The relatives who once filled our home now felt impossibly far away. For the first time in my life, I understood what true isolation felt like. It was not being physically alone. It was discovering that people had been taught an entirely different version of who you were. I looked at Margaret's empty chair and listened to the quiet settle around me. The calls had failed. The emails had failed. The letters had changed almost nothing. And as the evening slipped into night, I realized there was no one left to talk to except the woman who was no longer there. The house was silent as I sat alone at the kitchen table. The letters and emails from the past week spread out before me like fragments of a life I thought I knew. I traced my finger along the edge of one of Margaret's handwritten notes, feeling the texture of the paper, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to it. I remembered her laughter echoing through this very room, the way she would hum softly while preparing dinner, completely unaware that her presence would become a memory I would cling to for the rest of my days. I called Jason again, hoping that somehow hearing my voice would bridge the growing distance, but the line went straight to voicemail. I left a message, careful to keep my tone calm, explaining that I wanted to share some important documents Margaret had entrusted to me. I ended the call and waited, but no response came. The next day, I tried emails with attachments of photos and scanned letters, each message crafted carefully to avoid accusations, to simply present the truth, yet the replies were sparse and lukewarm, a simple acknowledgement or silence. I called Diane once more. Harold, it hurts me to say this, she began, but even when you reach out, most of them have accepted the version Vanessa has been sharing. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. All those years, and they believed her. It seems so, Diane said softly. I placed the receiver down and stared out the window, watching snow drift lazily across the yard. Each flake felt like a reminder of the moments lost, the laughter absent, the conversations that had been twisted. Margaret had always told me that people show you who they are if you are willing to pay attention, and I had learned the truth too late. The loneliness settled deep into my bones as evening approached. I walked to the living room, noticing the chair where Margaret would always sit to read the newspaper, her glasses perched delicately on the edge of the cushion. I ran my fingers across the armrest, imagining her reading silently, unaware that one day it would be empty. I thought about every holiday she had spent reminding me to reach out to family, Every birthday, I had quietly celebrated in anticipation of gatherings that never materialized. And now, sitting in the dim light, I realized that the isolation was not merely physical. It was the realization that the very people who should have known me had believed false narratives, that the connections we had built had been eroded by deception. Yet in the midst of this despair, a small flicker of awareness sparked. Margaret had left instructions. She had left evidence, and I understood now that the power to uncover the truth, to restore reality, was within my hands. I took a deep breath, feeling the first hint of resolve settle into me. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel completely helpless. The shadows in the room seemed less oppressive, as though they were receding slightly in anticipation of the actions I would take next. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I recognized that the story I had been given was not the story I had to accept, and the path to reclaiming the truth was beginning to appear before me. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and did something I had not done in years. I made a list, not of people to call or family events to attend, but of things I could still build. Margaret used to say that purpose was like a muscle. If you stopped using it, it slowly disappeared. I found one of my old project binders from my years as a construction engineer and spread it across the dining room table. For the first time in a long while, I spent hours focused on something other than loss. A week later, I visited the community center downtown. The director, a woman named Linda Harris, greeted me warmly. "Mr. Bennett, Frank tells me you designed half the commercial buildings on the east side of town." I laughed quietly. "Frank has always exaggerated." "Maybe," she replied with a smile. "But we could still use your help." They were launching a mentorship program for young trade apprentices. Electricians, carpenters, welders, and equipment operators. People just starting their careers. I agreed to attend one meeting, then another, then another. Soon I found myself reviewing plans, answering questions, and sharing lessons learned over 40 years in the field. One afternoon, a young man named Ethan approached me after a workshop. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Of course." He held up a blueprint. "How do you know if you are making the right decision when everyone disagrees with you?" I studied the drawing before looking back at him. "You make the decision you can still respect when you look in the mirror tomorrow morning." He nodded slowly. "I think I understand." As the weeks passed, people began calling me again. Not because they needed something from me, but because they valued what I knew. Linda invited me to help expand the program. Frank started stopping by every Friday afternoon. Diane called more often. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. One evening, while organizing old paperwork, I discovered several design concepts I had created years earlier for affordable senior housing projects. Margaret had loved those ideas. "One day you should finish these," she used to tell me. Instead of putting them back into storage, I began updating them. Page by page, sketch by sketch. I worked late into the evenings, filling notebooks with calculations and revisions. The process reminded me who I had been before family complications consumed so much of my attention. One afternoon, Linda walked into the community center carrying a folder. "Harold, you might want to see this." I opened it and found a proposal request from a regional nonprofit organization looking for consultants with construction experience. "You should apply," she said. I shook my head. "I am 74 years old." Linda crossed her arms. "And?" I smiled despite myself. "You sound exactly like Margaret." Then she must have been a smart woman. For the first time in months, I laughed without forcing it. Driving home that evening, I noticed the sky glowing orange over the Iowa fields. The future still felt uncertain, but no longer frightening. Somewhere between the mentorship program, the housing designs, and the opportunities beginning to appear, I had started rebuilding something important. Not my reputation, not my relationships, myself. And as I pulled into my driveway, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number from Chicago. Something told me the next chapter of this story was about to begin. I answered the call while sitting in my driveway, the engine still running. "Harold Bennett?" a woman asked. "This is Melissa Grant from Midwestern Community Housing." I immediately recognized the nonprofit Linda had mentioned. "Yes, this is Harold. We reviewed your proposal," she said. And frankly, we were impressed. I sat quietly for a moment, unsure I had heard her correctly. "Impressed?" I repeated. She laughed softly. "Very impressed. We would like to invite you to serve as a senior consultant on a regional housing initiative." I looked through the windshield at the fading Iowa sunset. For months, I had been measuring time by loss. Suddenly, something else entered the picture. Possibility. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in a conference room wearing a navy blue company jacket embroidered with my name. Beneath it were the words Senior Development Consultant. It was a small detail, but seeing those words stitched beneath my name affected me more than I expected. Not because of status, because it represented usefulness, purpose, contribution. Melissa introduced me to the project team. Everyone, this is Harold Bennett. Several people immediately recognized my name. Wait, one engineer said. You worked on the Riverfront Commerce Center? I nodded. Many years ago. We studied that project in graduate school. For the first time in a very long while, I was not being viewed through the lens of family history or misunderstandings. I was simply being seen for what I could do. The work moved quickly. Meetings turned into site visits. Site visits turned into planning sessions. Before long, younger architects were asking for my feedback. Contractors called seeking advice. One afternoon, Ethan visited the office carrying a folder of revised plans. I made the changes you suggested, he said. We reviewed the drawings together. You caught a drainage issue nobody else noticed, he added. How did you see that? I smiled. Experience usually arrives disguised as mistakes. Ethan laughed and wrote the sentence down in his notebook. The weeks passed. Slowly, my confidence returned. Not the confidence of youth. Something quieter, stronger. The confidence that comes from surviving disappointment and still choosing to contribute. One Friday morning, Melissa walked into my office carrying a small plaque. This belongs on your desk. It displayed my name and title in polished brass. I ran my thumb across the lettering. Harold Bennett, Senior Development Consultant. A simple nameplate, yet it felt symbolic. Proof that life had not ended with grief. Proof that identity could survive loss. That evening, I carried the plaque home and placed it beside a photograph of Margaret. You would have liked this, I said aloud. The house remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. As I stood there, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a familiar name. Jason. I stared at it for several seconds. Months ago, I would have answered immediately. This time, I simply looked at the screen while it rang. Because now the timeline had finally caught up to the present, and something told me my son was calling for a reason. The phone stopped ringing before I could decide whether to answer. I set it down and went back to the kitchen, but 20 minutes later it rang again. Jason. This time I answered. Hello. There was a pause. Dad. His voice sounded different. Careful. Measured. I have been trying to reach you. I pulled out a chair and sat down. I noticed. Another pause followed. Richard called me. Of course he had. I looked toward Margaret's photograph sitting beside the brass nameplate on the counter. What about? I asked, even though I already knew. He said there is a meeting next week. Jason cleared his throat. Something about Mom's estate. For months, I had been the one waiting for calls. The one hoping for conversations. The one trying to repair broken connections. Now the balance had shifted. I was no longer chasing answers. Others were. Yes, I said calmly. There is a meeting. Why did nobody tell me sooner? He asked. I almost smiled. The question carried an urgency that had been missing for a very long time. You knew how to reach me. Silence. Dad, that is not fair. I looked around the quiet kitchen. Fair is an interesting word. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally he asked, will you be there? Yes. Can we talk before then? I considered the question carefully. Months ago I would have agreed immediately. This time I answered differently. I think the meeting is the appropriate place. The disappointment in his voice was impossible to miss. Dad, good night, Jason. I ended the call. 3 days later, I drove to downtown Cedar Rapids under a gray autumn sky. Richard's office occupied the top floor of a historic brick building overlooking the river. When I stepped into the lobby, I immediately noticed two familiar figures near the reception desk. Jason stood beside Vanessa. They looked surprised to see me arrive so calmly. Vanessa forced a polite smile. Harold, I nodded. Vanessa. Jason stepped forward. Dad, can we talk privately? Not today. The receptionist directed us toward the conference room. As we walked down the hallway, I noticed something unexpected. Jason seemed nervous. Not angry. Nervous. Richard was already waiting when we entered. Several folders sat neatly arranged on the polished table. A television monitor hung on the wall. The blinds were partially closed. allowing thin bands of sunlight to stretch across the room. Nobody seemed comfortable. Richard greeted everyone and motioned toward the chairs. "Thank you for coming." We sat down. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Vanessa crossed her arms. Jason kept glancing toward the folders. Richard opened one of them and reviewed several pages. Then he looked directly at me. I gave a small nod. Whatever happened next, I was ready. Richard folded his hands together. "Before we discuss the estate," he said, "there are several items Margaret specifically instructed me to present." The air seemed to leave the room. Jason shifted in his chair. Vanessa's expression tightened. Richard reached for a remote control and pointed it toward the monitor on the wall. The screen flickered to life. A paused video appeared. My heart immediately recognized the image. Margaret, seated in her favorite chair, looking directly into the camera. The room became completely silent as Richard pressed his thumb against the play button. Margaret's image filled the screen. She wore a light blue sweater and sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then her voice filled the room. "If you are watching this, then Richard has decided it is time." Jason straightened in his chair. Vanessa looked down at the table. Margaret smiled gently at the camera. "This recording is not about punishment. It is about clarity." Richard remained silent beside the monitor. The only sound was Margaret's steady voice. Families do not fall apart in a single day. They drift apart one choice at a time. She lifted a folder into view. "For the last 2 years, I documented every major family communication involving Harold and me. Not because I expected conflict, because I wanted facts." Jason's expression changed immediately. Margaret continued, "Inside this folder are records, correspondence, invitations, responses, and statements. They speak for themselves." Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. Richard calmly replied, "Please wait until the presentation is complete." Margaret's eyes seemed almost alive on the screen. I also asked several people a simple question. What did they believe about Harold? She opened another document. The answers were surprisingly consistent. The monitor displayed scanned statements. Relatives described assumptions they had made. Some believed I preferred isolation. Others believed I was uninterested in family gatherings. Several thought I had intentionally distanced myself. Then Margaret spoke again. Every one of those assumptions was false. The room fell silent. Jason stared at the screen without blinking. Margaret continued, "Truth matters, not because it changes the past, because it reveals character." She paused. "Harold spent his life showing up for people, even when nobody noticed." My throat tightened, but I remained silent. There was no need to defend myself. Margaret was doing it better than I ever could. Vanessa finally spoke. "This does not prove anything." Richard opened a folder and slid several pages across the table. "Actually, it does." Vanessa looked down. Her face lost color. Jason reached for the documents. Email chains, message records, timelines. Every piece carefully organized. Every statement traceable. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Facts have a way of making noise unnecessary. Margaret's image remained on the screen. If you were searching for someone to blame, you were missing the point. Jason looked up sharply. For the first time, genuine uncertainty crossed his face. Margaret continued, "The real question is whether you recognize the cost of your choices." The room seemed smaller now. The confidence that had surrounded Jason and Vanessa when they arrived was gone. Richard folded his hands. "There is one final instruction," Margaret left. Jason immediately looked toward him. "What instruction?" Richard met his eyes. "The estate distribution." Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a glass of water. The air itself felt suspended. Richard slowly opened the final folder. Then he looked directly at me. "Harold, before I read this, your wife left one additional decision entirely in your hands." Across the table, Jason's face went pale. Because for the first time, everyone in the room realized something they had never considered before. The person holding the future was not the lawyer. It was me. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Richard's words settled over the room. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have. Jason looked from Richard to me and back again. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked. Richard opened the final folder and removed a signed document. 8 months before her passing, Margaret amended her estate plan. Vanessa leaned forward. "Amended it how?" Richard calmly adjusted his glasses. She transferred full discretionary authority regarding several family assets to Harold. Jason blinked. You mean Dad decides? That is correct, Richard replied. The confidence that had carried them into the meeting was gone now. In its place was uncertainty. Vanessa folded her hands tightly together. There has to be some mistake. Richard slid the notarized documents across the table. There is no mistake. Jason quickly reviewed the pages. Every signature, every witness, every date, everything had been properly documented. Margaret had planned carefully. Dad? Jason said quietly. Why did Mom do this? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. You would have to ask her. His eyes dropped to the table. For the first time, I saw something that looked less like frustration and more like reflection. Vanessa spoke next. Harold, surely we can discuss this. Her tone was polite, but different from before. Much different. I nodded. We are discussing it. She forced a small smile. You know we are family. I met her gaze. Family is not a sentence people remember only when something valuable is involved. The room fell quiet again. Nobody challenged the statement. Nobody could. Richard continued reviewing the estate documents. Certain accounts had already been designated. Several charitable commitments had been established. A scholarship fund had been outlined in detail. Every decision reflected Margaret's priorities. Every page reflected deliberate thought. Jason finally looked at me again. Dad, I know things have not been perfect. I raised a hand gently. You do not need to explain today. He seemed surprised by the interruption. For years I had been the one eager to continue difficult conversations. The one willing to absorb discomfort to keep peace. That version of me no longer occupied the chair. What happens now? Jason asked. I leaned back slightly. Now everyone has the truth. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue. The documents existed. The evidence existed. The decisions had already been made. Richard organized the folders into neat stacks. The remaining distributions will proceed according to the instructions outlined here. Jason stared at the paperwork for several moments. Then he quietly said something I did not expect. I did not realize how much had changed. I looked toward the dark monitor where Margaret's image had disappeared only minutes earlier. Neither did I. The meeting slowly came to an end. Chairs moved. Papers were collected. Coats were lifted from chair backs. Yet nobody seemed eager to leave. The truth had arrived, but truth rarely resolves everything immediately. Sometimes it simply removes the excuses. As I stood to leave, Jason stepped beside me. Dad, I turned. He looked older than I remembered. Can we talk soon? He asked. Not about documents. Not about money. Just talk. I studied his face for a moment. Then I gave the only honest answer I had. Maybe. He nodded slowly. It was not rejection. It was not forgiveness. It was simply a boundary. A real one. And as I walked toward the elevator, I realized something surprising. The meeting had ended. The estate questions had been answered. Yet the most difficult decisions still remained unresolved, waiting quietly somewhere beyond those office walls. 6 months later, the house felt different. Not because the memories were gone. They were everywhere. Margaret's favorite cookbook still sat on the same shelf. Her reading glasses still rested beside the lamp in the living room. The difference was that the memories no longer felt like open wounds. They felt like company. The scholarship fund Margaret designed was helping students across Iowa pursue careers in the skilled trades. The housing initiative had expanded into 3 counties. Every few weeks, I received letters from young people whose lives had been changed by opportunities they never thought possible. One afternoon, Ethan stopped by my office carrying a framed photograph from the first completed housing development. I thought you should have this, he said. I studied the image for several moments. Families standing on newly built porches. Children riding bicycles. People beginning new chapters. Thank you, I said quietly. You helped build this. He smiled. You taught us how. After he left, I sat alone for a while looking at the photograph. For years, I believed my value depended on who stayed. What I eventually learned was that my value had nothing to do with who left. The most important lesson from everything that happened was surprisingly simple. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors. They allow the right people to enter while protecting what matters most. I still spoke with Jason occasionally. Slowly, carefully. Some conversations were awkward. Some were meaningful. Trust was not something either of us could rebuild overnight. But for the first time, both of us understood that relationships require honesty more than proximity. The future remained unwritten, and perhaps that was enough. If you are listening to my story while carrying your own disappointment, your own betrayal, or your own loneliness, I want you to hear this. Do not allow another person's opinion to become your identity. Protect your finances. Protect your peace. Protect your sense of self. Most importantly, protect your ability to hope. Sometimes healing begins the moment you stop asking others to validate your worth. I also learned to trust something Margaret often called quiet wisdom. Some people call it intuition. Some call it faith. For her, it was simply listening carefully when life tried to teach a lesson. Looking back now, I believe she saw the truth long before I did. And somehow, even after she was gone, she still helped guide me toward it. Thank you for spending this time with me. Truly, stories matter because they remind us that we are not as alone as we sometimes feel. If even one part of this journey speaks to your heart, then perhaps something difficult you experienced can also become the beginning of something stronger. My name is Harold Bennett. I am 74 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never surrender your self-respect in exchange for someone else's approval. Tonight, as I sit on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the Iowa fields, there is a small brass nameplate resting beside Margaret's photograph. My name, my work, my life, and next to it, a handwritten note she left years ago that simply reads, "Keep building." The wind moves gently across the porch. The fields glow gold beneath the evening sky. And I finally understand that sometimes the people we lose leave behind the very strength we need to find ourselves again. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, and spend time with the other stories in this collection. There are more journeys ahead, more lessons, more people who discovered that endings are rarely the end. And perhaps in one of those stories, you may find a piece of your own.